Good afternoon, everybody. Such a pleasure to be in a warm, intimate space on this wonderful, sunny spring day here in Brunswick. I'm Frank Goodyear, one of the co-directors here at the Bowdoin College Museum of Art, and it's a pleasure to have the first public program in conjunction with the new exhibition that's upstairs, Figures from the Fire, J. Pierpont Morgan's Ancient Bronzes at the Wadsworth Atheneum Museum of Art. This exhibition is a wonderful collaboration between three museums. First and foremost, the Bowdoin College Museum of Art, and I want to thank my colleague Jim Higginbotham for his role in leading this. It's also a collaboration with the Yale University Art Gallery, and I will introduce Lisa Brody in a minute, but Lisa and Jim co-curated the exhibition. So Lisa, welcome, and thank you to all of our friends down in New Haven. And third of all, and perhaps most special, is the opportunity to work once again with the Wadsworth Atheneum Museum of Art in Hartford, Connecticut. And so pleased that Linda Roth, curator is here today to represent the Wadsworth. And we are so thrilled about this loan of ancient Greek and Roman bronzes, which you will learn more about. Let me, for a very quick introduction of Jim and Lisa. Jim is many things, associate professor of classics, also the chair of the classics department, as well as the curator of the ancient collection here at the Bowdoin Museum. Jim has done important excavation work in Israel, in Greece, and most interestingly, in Italy over a long period. He has curated many shows here and is an incredible steward of the remarkable ancient collection that is housed here at this institution. So, Jim Higginbotham. Lisa Brody is, for the past 15 years, has worked as a curator of ancient art at the Yale University Art Gallery. She is a graduate of Yale University, did her PhD work at the Institute of Fine Art in New York, and has published widely in her field, and has also done excavation work in Turkey, Greece, and Portugal, if I read correctly. So that we have experienced scholars, but also those who have literally gotten their hands dirty doing field work. So without further delay, I'm going to let Jim explain how we're going to proceed this afternoon. But again, thank you all for coming out, and congratulations, Jim and Lisa.
So before we get started, just a little bit about the plan. And again, I just want to say I'm just thrilled that to have worked with Lisa on this particular project, but also want to single out members of the museum staff, our preparators, Joe and Jose, Suzanne Bergeron, Laura Latman, our registrar, and then our team of curators here, Anne and Frank Goodyear, and Casey and Sean, who took the time to read through a lot of what we were putting up and helped us put this thing all together. Lisa and I plan to do a couple of short presentations. Lisa's going to lead off. And what we want to do is whet your appetite. We want to get you ready for what you want to see, kind of set the stage, set the context. And then we're all going to move upstairs. We can take our time, okay? So this will then be part gallery presentation. And I think that Lisa and I may have a couple of things that we just want to make sure that you do see and learn a little bit more about. But then we'd like to turn it over for you to explore and ask questions. We'll have a mic up there that is really meant to record for our recording that we're doing here. So if you grab the mic to ask a question, don't expect your voice to be booming about the museum. It won't happen that way. But it'll be just an opportunity to really kind of directly engage with what we have exhibited upstairs. And so it's a lot from the Wadsworth Atheneum, a little bit from us that we can talk about and answer as many questions as you have. And so without further ado, I'd love to introduce my colleague, Lisa Brody, and she will start us off, and then we'll get going. Go ahead, Lisa.
All right. Thank you so much, Jim and Frank, and thank you so much to everyone here for coming today to celebrate the opening of Figures from the Fire, J. Pierpont Morgan's Ancient Bronzes at the Wadsworth Atheneum Museum of Art, an exhibition that could not have taken place without the input and assistance of many colleagues. This project began many years ago when I was a relatively new curator at Yale. The head of my department, Susan Matheson, took me to visit the ancient collection at the Wadsworth Atheneum Museum of Art, where I'd never been. On the drive from New Haven to Hartford, she told me about the incredible Greek and Roman bronzes that were part of the J. Pierpont Morgan collection there. She knew that the renowned scholar David Midden of Harvard had included some of them in exhibitions that he had done in the 1960s, 70s, and 80s, and that he had long planned to study and publish them as a group. But that never came to fruition, and Susan thought that I might be interested in working on them. She introduced me to our colleagues in the Department of European Decorative Arts at the Wadsworth, Linda Roth, who I'm thrilled is here today, and Vanessa Sigalas. They were enthusiastic about supporting my work on the bronzes, and it never could have gone forward without their constant collegiality and generosity. Working with them has been one of the great pleasures of my career. Over the years, we had many conversations about what form the project would take, from a small exhibition at the Wadsworth to a small exhibition at Yale to a larger exhibition at one or both museums or somewhere else. The Wadsworth had, I think, 3 different directors over the course of this period, all of whom had different ideas about how it should manifest. I presented at academic conferences about some of the pieces and continued my research. Over the years, we talked about options for pursuing a print publication or a digital publication, and about the great potential for conservation and technical analysis. With the onset of the pandemic, all plans were put on hold or canceled. As the world once again began to open up around 2021, we resumed discussion of the bronzes, and we were now thrilled to know that there was interest in having the exhibition here at the Bowdoin College Museum of Art. I am particularly grateful to Anne and Frank Goodyear, James Higginbotham, and the staff of the museum here for their tireless work on this end of things. In addition, as always, to Linda and Vanessa, as well as others at the Wadsworth, Director Matthew Hargraves, CEO Jeff Brown, conservator Casey Mallinckrodt, and photographer Alan Phillips. I'm also grateful to the Wadsworth Atheneum for their support of the book, and to Mary Kaysen for her most skillful editing. Founded in 1842, the Wadsworth Atheneum Museum of Art is the oldest public art museum in the United States. Its encyclopedic collection includes nearly 50,000 works of art, ranging in date from antiquity to today. One of the museum's major early benefactors was John Pierpont Morgan Sr., who financed the construction of the Junius Spencer Morgan Memorial Building from 1907 to 1915, and was responsible for a bequest of over 1,300 objects to the museum in 1917. Included among these were 82 exquisite Greek and Roman bronzes that Morgan had acquired for his personal collection. These objects, together with major works from his collection of European decorative arts, have remained highlights of the Wadsworth Atheneum's collection for over a century. Many of the most important Morgan bronzes have long been on permanent display at the Wadsworth Atheneum. Some are installed in the ancient Mediterranean galleries here, and some others in the Cabinet of Art and Curiosity. Both of these settings provide important context for the objects. In the ancient galleries, the bronzes can be appreciated and understood as examples of sculpture, furniture, and vessels that functioned in Greek and Roman settings together with objects of glass, clay, and stone. In the Cabinet of Art and Curiosity, they shine as examples of Gilded Age collecting grouped with novelties such as gems and mineral specimens. Creating a special exhibition focused on a selection of the ancient bronzes in the Morgan collection allows for yet another perspective on this important group of objects. A close focus on each work of art showcases the object's craftsmanship, technique, and quality of artistry. John Pierpont Morgan belonged to one of the wealthiest and most elite families of the Gilded Age. Born in Hartford in 1837, he moved with his family first to Boston and then to London. Educated in the United States, Switzerland, and Germany, he entered into a career in international banking and railroads alongside his father, Junius Spencer Morgan, but also became increasingly interested in philanthropy and collecting. Although not specifically educated in art history or connoisseurship, through his classical education, global travels, and lavish lifestyle, Morgan developed a taste for acquiring works of fine art and antiquities. Morgan began collecting art in the 1890s, and his driving principle was quality. He is alleged to have said, quote, "No price is too great for an object of unquestioned beauty and known authenticity." His range was eclectic and encyclopedic. Rare books, illuminated manuscripts, fossils, gems, and minerals, indigenous North and South American art and artifacts, Byzantine and medieval ivories and enamels, old master paintings, furniture, watches, tapestries, armor, and ancient Mediterranean and Near Eastern sculpture. And the objects you see on the screen are just a selection from the Wadsworth Athenaeum. Morgan took pleasure in acquisition, end quote, and would acquire almost anything as long as it fulfilled his primary requirements of rarity, quality, and aesthetic value. One of his persistent goals was to acquire objects that he considered the very best of European art and culture in order to elevate the art and culture of the United States. Much of Morgan's collection was placed on long-term loan to the Victoria and Albert Museum in London. This loan included 1,618 objects by 1912. But upon the repeal of the US import tax on works of art in 1912, Morgan had the objects brought back to the United States, at which time planning began for an exhibition celebrating his collection at the Metropolitan Museum of Art. The exhibition contained approximately 4,000 works of art, including the 82 ancient bronzes that later went to the Wadsworth Athenaeum, and took place in 1914 after Morgan's death. Morgan acquired most of his ancient bronzes between 1902 and 1913. He did not necessarily spend time choosing individual objects to purchase, but rather worked with dealers to acquire several at a time. In April 1906, for example, he purchased a group of 52 Greek and Roman bronzes. And it was just identified as that. He clearly hadn't seen them and didn't know what was in this group. He was open to buying a variety of figure and vessel types, males and females, gods and mortals, humans, animals, and hybrid mythological creatures, freestanding statuettes, and furniture embellishments. They represent the art of ancient Greece, Rome, Egypt, and Etruria. Morgan does not seem to have had great interest in their original contexts or histories. He cared primarily about their aesthetic attributes. He wanted the works of art for their exquisite craftsmanship, quality of composition and execution, and preservation. The bronzes in Morgan's collection represent the very best of ancient bronzeworking, with carefully rendered clothing, hair, and fur, and adorned with inlays of silver and other luxury materials. It is no surprise that Morgan's bronze collection includes not only figural sculpture, but also vessels, as such diversity is consistent with his interest in collecting from other periods. According to invoices archived at the Morgan Library and Museum in New York, most of the bronzes were purchased from an antiquarian firm founded by the brothers Cesare and Ercole Canessa. They were well-known dealers of the early 20th century based in Naples, Paris, and New York, and the source of the vast majority of Morgan's ancient art acquisitions generally. The Canessa brothers specialized in selling antiquities that came from the Bay of Naples and elsewhere in Italy. One of their most spectacular transactions was that of the so-called Bosco Reale hoard, a group containing hundreds of exquisite silver vessels, as well as about 1,000 gold coins and jewelry. This hoard was discovered in 1895 during excavations at Bosco Reale, the site of several wealthy Roman villas that was buried in the catastrophic volcanic eruption of Mount Vesuvius in AD 79 that destroyed Pompeii and Herculaneum. Found on land that was privately owned by Vincenzo da Prisco, the finds were sold to the Canessa brothers, who took the objects to Paris and offered them to the Louvre, which balked at the high price tag. The Bosco Reale scenario reflects the lack of effective cultural heritage legislation at the time concerning the sale or export of archaeological materials from Italy. The Canessas are now thought to have eluded border control by organizing a fictitious transalpine amateur bicycle race from San Remo in Italy to Nice in France, giving to their many accomplices in the large crowd of participants a piece of silverware each to hide in their clothing, bags, and even water bottles. I know it's not directly related to these bronzes, but I had to include the story because it tells you about the dealers that Morgan was working with. The dealers were preparing to divide the hoard and sell the objects individually when the majority were purchased by Baron Edmund James de Rothschild for 500,000 francs, and he subsequently donated it to the Louvre. So the market for antiquities was exploding in the late 19th and early 20th centuries, and unlike today, notably, there was a kind of glory gained from such evasion of legitimate restrictions on exports, imports, and provenance research. Because Morgan built his collection by working with dealers and frequently acquiring whole collections of objects in a single purchase, there is no solid archaeological context for any of these bronzes. So Jim's going to talk a little bit about generally context of ancient bronzes, but again, we don't have that information for these objects in particular. While this does limit the amount of information that can be obtained from them, it is clear that ongoing research and attempts to reconstruct their history and potential original context are essential in understanding relationships among ancient works of art and broader themes about art and society in the ancient Mediterranean. Morgan arranged for the publication of several catalogs of his collection, written by respected scholars in their respective fields. These were financed by Morgan himself, printed in limited quantities, and sent to a carefully selected list of individuals and institutions. The catalog of his bronzes, which also included a few pieces in silver and gold, was published in 1913. It was written by Sir Cecil H. Smith, who had previously been keeper of Greek and Roman antiquities at the British Museum and had contributed to several of the British Museum's collection catalogs. From 1909 until his retirement in 1924, Smith was the director of the Victoria and Albert Museum. And in addition, he was the author of numerous books and articles on ancient art generally. At the time of Morgan's death in 1913, his estate was valued at $118 million, which seems to be approximately $3.5 billion in today's currency. And his art collection made up nearly half of this wealth. His last will and testament indicated that his collection was to be made, quote, permanently available for the instruction and pleasure of the American people. He left the details of implementing this task entirely up to his son, J.P. Morgan Jr. Morgan Jr. ended up selling nearly half of his father's collection, several thousand objects, at auction, and dividing most of the remaining pieces between the Metropolitan Museum of Art and the Wadsworth Atheneum, with the latter receiving a bequest of approximately 1,300 objects, including the 82 ancient bronzes. Morgan's collection of stained glass went to the Victoria and Albert Museum, while his books, manuscripts, and drawings became the foundation of the Morgan Library and Museum in New York. J. Pierpont Morgan made a significant impact on the American cultural landscape in many ways. Perhaps best known for his leadership in the banking industry during the Gilded Age, his philanthropy and collecting play an equally important role in his legacy, particularly regarding the cultural institutions in New York and Connecticut. Like many of his contemporaries, Morgan was faithful to a few particular museums and had a strong desire to influence their missions, collections, and cultural heritage. His name appears so frequently at places such as the Met and the Wadsworth Atheneum that it is difficult to imagine how the histories of these institutions would have evolved without his touch. The collection of Morgan bronzes at the Wadsworth remains today one of the museum's greatest treasures. For this exhibition, I selected several of the most exquisite of Morgan's bronzes. And of course, as I said at the beginning, most of these were already on display in the beautifully curated galleries of the Wadsworth. And so I'm again grateful to Linda and the rest of the staff at the museum for not only allowing, but really encouraging this loan, which on a logistical level meant finding substitutions for the cases and writing new labels and all that sort of thing behind the scenes. The bronzes in this exhibition represent the full range of Morgan's collection. There are human and divine figures, animals, fantastic creatures, furniture attachments, utensils, and vessels. They showcase the best of ancient bronze working technique. So when you go into the galleries to look at them, I would encourage you to get up close. Jim and I talked at length about how to best install these objects, and we purposely limited the number of them in each case. They're quite small, so they are best appreciated from a close vantage point. When you examine them closely, look for traces of copper or silver inlay among the details. See in the eyes and here. These are just a few examples. They're all over the exhibition. Think about the complex casting process and the skill of the artisans who made these objects. Consider what their original context might have been, as decorative objects in a wealthy home or as dedications in a religious sanctuary. Think about them surviving for centuries before being purchased by Morgan as the highest caliber of example of ancient bronze working. I hope that you will enjoy seeing them here together as a group, both for what they can tell us about Gilded Age collecting of antiquities and for what they reveal about bronze works of art from the ancient Mediterranean. Thank you.
Great. So I would like to add, from an archaeological perspective, a few words just about context. The bronzes that we're looking at are all on small scale. And the obvious question to ask is, what accounts for that? And what accounts for the survivability of the small pieces, whereas when we read literature, ancient literature about sculpture and antiquity, it's the large pieces that are the most celebrated, the ones that were cult statues in great temples, the Greeks were some of the first to really create life-size sculptures. The Egyptians had some, but the Greeks, would do these and use casting processes, and they were talked about a lot, and the sculptors were actually noted. but the vast majority of those don't survive. So this is a question about survivability. And we think about the foot that we'll be able to go up and see in a little bit, because it's a vestige of that story about survivability. The other piece of this is scale, right? So I'm showing you two pieces. On the left is a work that's a helmeted warrior that's up in our exhibition, but on the right is a statue that was actually found from under the ocean in the early 1970s near Riace in southern Italy. It is one of two they're actually about 6'6", 6'7" tall, so they're very, very big, life-size warriors. But you can see the similarity in pose and everything, and the comparisons are really apt. And then one of the things that we see with the small-scale bronzes and is that they often imitate more famous works in larger scale, and then they were produced in greater numbers. And so that gets us part of the story in terms of their survivability. The other part is they were much smaller, right? So in terms of relative scale, the statuettes and figurines and the fragments of bronzes that we have upstairs are in small pieces, and so they can escape notice from people who want to recycle the sculptures. And so bronze sculpture is one of the most often recycled materials. Marble's a little bit harder, but you can do that too. You have to burn it and break it down. But bronze, you can readily convert into something that can be quite useful. So the big statues we lose because they are in prominent places, they're of a significant scale, and they invite not only people who are wanting to convert them to other things, but the ire of people who might be offended by what they represent. And so this is what you often get, right? So, and what we look around is you'll get the statue bases that are at a lot of ancient sites, and I love going around looking for them, and then finding out where the bronze statue used to be. And so here, this is on the island of Delos. It's in the museum there now, sanctuary to Apollo, that has a sandaled foot. It's the only thing left that still is in there. They broke off the statue, but the foot remained remarkably intact because they're often doweled right into the stone. And so you can go around. This is at the site of Duga, or ancient Thuga in Tunisia, a Roman and Numidian site. And you can see where the feet would have been anchored, but they've all gone. So the large statues are missing. The Riace bronze that we looked at before survives because it went down in a shipwreck. And the Romans were very keen on, collecting, just like Morgan, things that they saw in the Greek world or in the eastern part of the Mediterranean, putting them on a vessel and then taking them across the sea. And some of those boats didn't make the journey safely. And so the sculptures that we do often see are often preserved in this kind of catastrophic and remarkable way. So with small bronzes, we have to think about context. And Lisa talked a little bit about this. We can find them in a lot of different spaces in the ancient world. But one of the things that links them all is that they're much more connected to the private world than the public world. So in Roman society, statuettes and figurines like this could often be placed inside household and garden shrines. And so here's an example from Pompeii, the House of the Golden Cupids. It's in a shrine that's called a Lararium that usually has household deities, but the Romans could add deities from all over the place, and they become literal religious flypaper for kind of religious beliefs. And so this is an old photograph showing you the statues that were in place, seated and standing figures when the site was first excavated. And prominent among these, and this is not in our exhibition, but I wish it were, is one of the representations of Alar that's one of these household gods that looks over the home. And so in a religious context, small-scale sculptures have a place. They can be in a domestic setting. They can really represent the eclectic religious interests of the house owner. They could also be in a dedication at larger sanctuaries where someone can afford to have a bronze representation of the deity or them as an offering bearer and leave it at the sanctuary on an altar. Those things could be collected there, displayed for a time, and then maybe put into depositories that are often underground. And that helps preserve them, right? The big statues stay out, the little statues get saved. Now, in a whole different vein, and I just want to say just a little bit about this because we think about the figures as standalone kind of miniature versions of larger sculptures or stand-ins for gods and heroes and mortals. But bronze was a very useful material. It was used for a lot of things that we just kind of take for granted, door hinges and locks and keys. This is a scene, it's from Herculaneum and the carbonized wood that used to be in place of a door to one of the houses. And you can already see the attachments that are made of bronze that are used just as we would use them today to open the doors, to serve as door knockers and rings to pull the doors open. So they things that are fairly commonsensical in that way. There's some very special pieces in this collection, and Lisa showed them, and they are these projections, we call them protomes, that were part of larger pieces of furniture connected to yet another kind of context. And that context is dining and entertaining. And you think about the vessels that Lisa showed us with the oinakaways, or the pitchers and the ladles that are used for distributing drinks at a party. People would recline on couches in the Roman world and be able to have a piece of furniture that has bronze accents and be able to eat from silverware, but also bronzeware that might be used for serving of the food. And they would do it in these kind of interesting settings. This is a typical one that is often referred to as a triclinium because it's designed to accommodate 3 couches. Kline is from a Greek word for couch, and you could have them in 3 sides, and you have an open area where people could come and bring the food. And in those, when you restore the couches, and the wood often decays, but the bronze pieces and the decorations are the things that survive. So in toto, you just have to think about as you walk around upstairs and you look at the furniture pieces, you look at the little statuettes of gods, you look at the small artifacts, and then think, what accounts for their survivability. There's a lot of stories that help put them in their context. Okay, thank you. So before we start to make the migration upstairs, and I know that both Lisa and I are here, and if anyone has questions or anything, comments you would like to make, I'm sure that Lisa and I would love to answer anything if people had them. Yeah, Susan.
You have some extraordinary things that don't seem to have any rival. Oh, they don't seem to have any rival or example like that Spartan.
That Spartan warrior.
Yeah. And it's great that there's a vase painting with a transverse helmet, but I would love to know more about that guy. What can possibly be a similar entity?
Yeah.
I mean, I would too. I would really do love to know more. No, we can look at him upstairs, but he's probably the first object in this collection that caught my attention, and he's obviously on the cover of he's really important. And the fact that there's no real 3-dimensional parallel for that is so interesting and intriguing. So thank you, and we'll talk about it upstairs.
But I would say, just in terms of what is lost and what has been saved, you think at Delphi, as you walked up the sacred way, you come right inside the sanctuary. There was a large monument with full-size sculptures of Spartans. And all the statues are gone. The bases are there. But, so we have no idea, if our statue or the statue from the Athenaeum is modeled after something that was well known in antiquity and not, but has not survived.
I just wanted to say that Lisa's written an article about the warrior that will come out in a book in September. It's a book about Mormon.
Thank you.
Yes.
I bring the biography of Wallace Stevens, the poet, and make documentary of him. And his office was very close to the Wadsworth Atheneum, and he skipped lunch every day. It was fairly heavy set him. And during lunch, he would go down to the Wadsworth Atheneum and look at these things. So I'm fascinated to know, I'm curious to know if this collection of bronzes was very often on display, or if it was sort of came and went to the museum.
I might have to put you on the spot for that one, Linda.
I mean, the bronzes have been on display
mostly since the 1980s, for sure. I frankly don't know where they were in the museum before that, when Wallace. Yeah, so I actually just don't know whether they were on display then, but I'm imagining yes. It's just hard to know. I mean, I might be able to figure that out archivally, but his path home is marked by markers all the way, close to where I live. So I see the Wallace Stevens markers every day going home. But so I'm not sure if they've been on view, continuously.
Hi, thank you. Jim, Lisa, I don't know which one of you would answer, but are these to any extent datable? In other words, do we know what period they're coming from, what century they're coming from? Were they particularly trendy at some times? And
I mean, Jim can talk about this too. They are difficult to date. I mean, archaeological material that we don't have that kind of context, obviously. So what we look at is technique, style, comparanda. All of these are sort of broadly Greek and Roman. There are others in Morgan's collection at the Wadsworth that are from Etruscan culture and Egyptian and maybe Near Eastern, but these are Greece and sort of Italy. And I mean, the Wadsworth had done it first, and then I went back and reviewed the dates, and in most cases, supported it or changed it slightly based on comparanda with other surviving figures. Basically, is we've talked about, and I've talked with various conservators and conservation scientists about whether there's some technical analysis that could help with dating or like sourcing where they were made, if you can pin down, but it seems to not be easily done at this point with the technology available.
There's some examples, like there's one mirror in the collection. And in the mirrors, the Etruscans did this, the Greeks did this too. They actually changed the composition of copper and tin in there. So it's usually a little bit more than tin. Typically bronze has something close to 9 parts copper to 1 part tin. But you can have something much more tin rich. And it makes the metal look a little bit different, and it makes it so it's easier to reflect. And you can notice on this particular one, there is a difference to that. So that on a technological point of view, we could confirm that, but that's one example. But as Lisa says, it's unfortunate about some of these things is that we lack specific context. But we rely on a vast knowledge that is based on pose and style, and in order to give an estimate. So the labels that we've put up include those estimates. And if we know something more about the provenance, we'll volunteer that.
Yeah, and the comparanda doesn't have to just be other bronzes too. So in some cases, like the Spartan, the warrior, we can look at vase painting examples and the drapery of the cloak and use that, or terracotta figurines, marble examples. We're looking for comparable style and pose and composition.
I can remember one very nice phrase that Wallace Stevens used when he would go down and watch float all the bronzes on his lunch hour. He would refer to it as dancing around in the sunshine. So when you look at these, think that Wallace Stevens considered looking at these bronzes to be dancing around in the sunshine.
Yeah. Yeah, so true.
Can you say anything about the artists who created these and perhaps the marketplace in which they were sold? Is there any historical information about the trade of these back in the day?
So I think, and again, I'll see what Jim has to say here. I mean, in terms of ancient sculpture and named artisans or really sort of literary evidence for the craft, that's the large scale pieces, right? So we know some sculptors who were renowned and they made large scale bronze and marble statues of humans and gods and goddesses. The small scale figures were produced mostly through a lost wax casting technique. So a figure would be made out of, usually maybe out of clay, and then surrounded with wax, and then a mold made around that with clay. So it's like a wax sandwich, right? And then the molten bronze would be poured into the mold, and it would go where there was wax, melting out the wax as it ran through the mold. And then cooled and hardened, and then the mold would be broken away. So it became, at a certain point, once this technique was refined, really a sort of mass production kind of technique where the craftsmen who made it were just sort of churning these out for people to buy for their Lararia or the furniture or things to be used in the home or in the sanctuary. So while we can say things about the process, I don't think we can really say too much about the people behind the process for most of them. What do you think?
Well, I think that's true. We have very little information about who's actually doing it. There's a famous vase by a black figure artist called, it's the red figure artist called the Foundry Painter, because it actually shows it's a Kylix drinking cup, and on the underside of the drinking cup, it actually shows the interior of one of these bronze working places where they have the furnace set up and they have people with the tools. And there's a great deal of interest in that because it looks like they're showing people who are slaves and things like that are part of this this group here. So that's something that takes us, into the 6th century BCE. A great author, Latin author, Pliny the Elder, gives us a lot of information about bronze, and he's very specific about some of the things like furniture attachments. And he talks about the island of Aegina as being a really popular place for the making of that, and they had a special recipe for their bronze, and Corinth had another recipe for their bronze. But yes, we don't know that much. They don't often sign their works. Anything else? Okay, so why don't we begin the migration upstairs? And as you begin to look around, you'll notice, and it's just the background, in the niches and on the walls are some sculptures in marble that are actually derived from bronze originals. So you can think about the other side, and we can talk about that a little bit. And I have one plaque that actually shows a bronze statue on its base illustrated there so that we can get that kind of full context. But we'll all meet you upstairs, and we'll wait for everyone to convene, and then we can begin or continue our discussion. So what Lisa and I thought we would do is to highlight something that stands out to us, say a little bit more about it, but really, we want to let you use your own eyes and raise questions. And so what we'll be able to do after a couple little specialties that we can highlight is that If you see something and you have a question that begs, then if you wouldn't do the old-fashioned way of raising your hand, and then Christian can come over and get you lined up, and we have the magic microphone that Amanda has holding, and we'll have as much of a discussion as we possibly can. And so Lisa and I will help facilitate that. Would you like me to start or you start?
Either way.
Either way. Okay, well, you go right ahead.
Okay.
Here.
Well, I think we have to look at him. And then, as I said, as Jim said, we can talk about any others and answer questions. But I would encourage you to come closer.
Don't be afraid. Yeah. He's fierce looking, but
And get as close as you can and look from all sides. We very deliberately put this figure not only front and center, but in his own case, so you can see him from all sides, because it really is worth seeing from all sides. If you walk around, the geometry of this figure is pretty remarkable in its own right. And I'd love to just ask, what do you see? If anyone could sort of pull out something here that they find interesting or that they notice about it, describe it for those who are maybe a little farther away. Sorry, and doing it this way means you have to run around with the mic, but
You can see his individual toes.
you can see his individual toes, yes, which is amazing. Well, so his toes, why? I mean, this is a very, what I'm bringing out are sort of like, be on a very basic level here. The fact that we can see his toes means that he's not wearing any shoes. So that's interesting, right?
How can he fight?
Okay, so how can he fight? What makes us think he has anything to do with fighting?
You said so.
Okay, on the label. But he's got a helmet, right? So that's why we identify him as a warrior. So he's got a helmet but no shoes. That's kind of weird.
And it looks like there could have been possibly a spear in that little in his hand.
Yeah, so he's got his left and right. His left hand is out like this, and it's sort of making a fist. And it does look like there might have been it was difficult even to see. I think there was, it doesn't go all the way through now, but I think it was originally holding something. So if you think he's a warrior, he's got a helmet, maybe a spear or a staff of some sort. Yes?
I think the draping is very unusual.
The draping.
I haven't seen draping like that, particularly in what you're describing as a warrior figure. The body would be more important to show and warrior, but this draping, it's almost modern in its angularity.
It is. The draping is amazing. So if you think of a warrior figure, think about ancient Greek or Roman warriors that you've seen, and there are, I don't know where everything is. There's the Mars figure has, and well, he's nude, but there's anyway, usually, he would have armor and maybe holding a shield or a spear or bow and arrow, but all he's got is the helmet and then this cloak draped around him. And the style of it is what makes this really spectacular in terms of its quality and its craftsmanship, right? It's very, as you said, modern, which I really agree with. And the angles and the drapery of it, it's very imposing for something that's like 5 inches tall. I think that if you see the photo of this on the screen downstairs or on the cover of the book, you might think it's much larger with its sort of presence. And then the fact that it's barefoot. So what does that mean? That he's a warrior, but he's barefoot, so he's not in battle. So there are a lot of questions about this figure. And I'd love to say that the article that Linda mentioned has all the answers. and it really has 0 answers. So there are a lot of questions about him. What do you notice, or if you can describe in particular, so the helmet is one of the main attributes of this figure as it stands today, as it survives today. So what do we notice about the helmet? The shape of it. What about the shape? I'm sorry.
It's halo-like.
It's halo-like. So if you can think of maybe a more typical ancient Greek helmet, it's got this, it's made of iron usually, or bronze. I guess more often bronze, but, and in this case, it's covering the face and all around the back of the head, and it has a crest on top, usually sort of feathers. But it's usually going this way, sort of front to back. And you'll see that, like, as you now go out and look at other museums' collections, like, this is so unusual, really almost unique. So that's what I got interested in and started looking for parallels. Almost all the parallels that exist, and there aren't very many, 3 or 4 max, are 2-dimensional. So it's vase painting, and it shows a frontal figure of a warrior, and he's wearing a helmet, and he has this crest going kind of ear to ear, transverse crest. But if you think about that, a 2-dimensional rendering of this figure, if the crest were actually front to back and you were doing that 2-dimensionally, you'd only have a line, right? Does that make sense? So potentially, the artist of that vase, and they did this, they sort of played with perspective, might change the direction of the crest just to show that it was there. Does that make sense, what I'm saying? But this doesn't need it, it's 3-dimensional. So, but the question is, do the vases help us or not? The only 3-dimensional example that I found in the research that I did is a small bronze man on horseback. So he's not in armor either, but he's riding on horseback at the British Museum, and he's got a helmet. The crest doesn't survive, so it must have been made as a separate piece, but there are holes on top of the head in that direction, presumably for the attachment of a crest. But it's not a particularly helpful piece of comparanda because we don't know anything about it either. We don't know where it came from. It's one of these that's said to be from somewhere in Italy, but it doesn't have an archaeological context. It doesn't have a good date. So this guy, and I'll move on, or I'll let Jim talk about something. We can look at other pieces. But this guy had long been called the Spartan warrior. And you will see that in a lot of publications of this figure. And you'll notice that that's not what I call him. I called him a draped warrior because I do think the drapery is one of the most important aspects of it. The identification as Spartan seems to have begun with David Mitton, who's the scholar that I mentioned, who was at Harvard for years and years and was an incredible scholar, particularly of bronze sculpture, but Greek sculpture generally, and did several exhibitions and published this piece. And back in the 1960s, wrote in the label or the entry for it in his publication, possibly from the area around Sparta. But I don't know why he said that. But David Mitton said it, so everyone else started repeating it, and it sort of entered the literature, so much so that if you then go on your computer and Google, Spartan warrior or ancient Sparta, they talk about what a warrior in Sparta looked like, and they use this as an example. Like children's books on Greek armor use this as an example for Spartan warrior. So I don't know. So that's what, it's been a fascinating piece to research. I don't have any answers. I just have a lot of questions, but at least here we can look really closely.
I think his
his arm is a little, it looks very at ease, doesn't it? It doesn't look warriorish.
Yeah, he's definitely not fighting. So that's where,
He's going to take a bath.
yeah. I mean, that's where he's often also called an officer, somebody of sort of high status. Maybe he's, now I'm just sort of speculating, maybe he's giving a speech, or because he's barefoot, maybe he's making a sacrifice in a sanctuary or something. Yeah.
Lisa and Caroline and others who've made observations. This is so fascinating. It's interesting to me that by the 19th century and well before that, ancient art is seen as an exemplar of, idealism. But it's also very interesting, Lisa, to hear you speaking about the degree to which figures in this exhibition are also picking up on aspects of everyday culture. So I wondered if there's sort of two parts to this question. I wondered if you might be able to speak a little bit about the relationship between idealization and a desire also to depict the quotidian. And I'm also interested in whether literary sources have helped you to make any decisions about what might be happening or who might be represented in a given work of art. Thank you.
And as far as the quotidian goes, one figure that struck me is the beggar with the black conval hat. And that juxtaposition makes this exhibit so rich.
I guess I would say in terms of sort of portraiture and individualization, this is where, as Jim was talking about, the large-scale sculptures, the foot and whatever it was attached to, is much more likely to have been a portrait, or, if it was divine, maybe not, but at least something individualized. Because of their scale, I think it would have been really difficult to do that, and that probably wasn't what was considered important, I think. I think it was more like the attributes. So this figure on the end here is a representation or a version of Mars Ultor, which would have been, someone could see it from as far away as I am and in antiquity and recognize it because it was a known type and it was Mars. And that was enough, and that was what was intended. Literary sources, again, I think, Jim went through a few that refer to bronzes that are helpful, but I don't know, what do you think? They're not terribly helpful.
Not terribly helpful with this, but it's interesting when you think about ideal, and we looked at body types, for the very kind of athletic nude with the helmet on top. It doesn't look like someone who would actually go into battle that way. That would be kind of silly, but it's supposed to represent something more lofty. In the same case, there are a couple of figures, though, that this becomes very popular in what we call the Hellenistic period. So, as we get into the late 4th and into the 3rd century, of depicting things that are unusual to the normal viewer. And so they're labeled here as foreigners or barbarians. It'd be great just to, once you have time to go around, to take a look at that and what distinguishes that. What did they do to make them less than ideal or make them more different so that you would say, oh, that doesn't look like a Greek? And this subtle things. It could be, the hat that they wear, just as Steve was talking about. It could be the jewelry that they have around there. Like Celts often have these great necklaces, torques around their necks. Wearing pants. And we have one figure over here that has trousers on, right? So, and that's kind of unusual. And so there is that notion of contrast there, and the Romans will pick up on that, so they'll be able to display easily something that can be ideally put forth as a god. Mars Ultor was well-known deity, big temple in Rome. There's lots of copies of him, so you can recognize him pretty easily. but maybe a barbarian on horseback takes a little bit more digging. You know, we know of monuments that were constructed in say, Western Turkey that displayed these people who, the Gauls and others like that way. So that's a kind of an interesting thing. And Steve was just mentioning one particular piece here that is labeled as a hunchback, you know, and he's sitting down, he's kind of looking at his feet, he's wearing a conical cap. There's a lot that's different and hardly ideal about that. And this becomes a really popular theme, you know, in the period after Alexander the Great and as we go into the Roman period. This represents a different kind of vision, you know, we think.
We have time for maybe one more question.
Should ask this back at the ranch, as they say. But all of this, the examples with silver inlay, I mean, presumably this means that they were owned by fairly wealthy. I mean, this must have been the high end of the market. I mean, how common is it to find the bronzes with these silver inlays and additions?
I mean, I guess it's not uncommon, but I would agree they're all the high end, they're all from the elite world.
Yeah. And the chasing doesn't often survive.
Yeah.
And you know, some of the large-scale sculptures that we do have wonderful chasing of different metals. And so using copper, which is redder on the lips, and then, you know, using silver for the teeth, you know, and so it begins to make them hauntingly more real. And then you apply glass or stone for the eyes and the insets. And, you know, and you think about even the fillets or headbands that they would wear would have the meanders rendered in copper and different colors. And so a lot of these small figurines that are here would have looked more polychromatic than they do right now. And bronze is durable, it survives. It's really kind of hard to get rid of it, but, you know, gold and silver can flake off.
Because one of the things when you were talking about the kind of workshop production that created so many of these, and on the one hand, it certainly obviously made it possible to replicate on a larger scale. But then when you look at the details of some of the individual pieces, like, which is why you wanted to do this show in the first place. So the ladle, and it's hard to see the way but you can see the duck teeth underneath the bill of the duck. And just that attention to detail and the finish of some of these things, I think it makes me feel like they were, you know, really the high end of production, even if the production was, you know, in larger foundries and workshops.
Yeah.
Right. And we have to be careful about using a word like mass production in an ancient context. You can make something in a mold, and that means you can possibly reproduce it a few times, and because then the mold is no longer usable. And even in a casting process, mixing the bronze right, getting it to the right temperature, then, you know, getting it ready to pour, and there must have been lots of mistakes that we don't know about, and then waiting for the right kind of cooling time before you can break it out of the mold. And then you're going to have to kind of work with some of the flashing and other things around it. And then you're going to have to get someone really skilled who's going to go in there and apply the silver and do all those kinds. So even a small bronze is time consuming, you know. So there's not like a factory just kind of pumping these things out. They will do that with terracotta, right? That I could accept the kind of a notion of mass production, because you could pop those things out and have almost anyone begin to decorate them. But these, I think, is pretty specialized.
Before we break up, I want to recommend the catalog that the Wadsworth Athenaeum has produced with essays by Jim and Lisa, just hot off the press. We have it downstairs in the gift shop. But to Linda and Lisa and Jim, thank you so much for a wonderful exhibition. We're thrilled.